Hi, folks. So I want to report now a more global perspective on the current measures of the lockdown because I've been quite focused on the UK, being a resident here, and also on America, but just because we tend to get a lot of American news here because obviously it's the same language. But I've been spending the last few days looking more at reports from different countries to try and get more of a global perspective because, of course, it is a global phenomenon. And I've been getting all sorts of different reports, and I just wanted to give a flavour of those from different regions of the world. So I'm going to start off in South America at the moment. It's an area I don't know a lot about, to be honest. Um, but I know that there are a lot of controversial governments, and there's a lot of tension between those, and that's being reflected at the moment as well within the current situation of the shutdown measures. Because as well, there's a lot of poverty in the area. Like with Africa, what we've got is regions where people are being ordered to stay at home, but they have quite a lack of resources, which they don't have in the West. So there's people with very little money for food, for example, that are really struggling. In El Salvador, in particular, people were really out in protest because of the poverty, because they can't be ordered to stay home if there's no food. From a very practical point of view, there were El Salvadorian protests. They were dispersed by the police, and the government have now said that they will provide food and are currently distributing food at the moment. Whether or not they're able to distribute enough in time, we'll see, and that's a changing situation. In Nicaragua, like with Sweden, they've had very sort of relaxed measures, in fact. So they've been giving people advice and guidance, giving out equipment for people to use, and they've been really criticised by the media, especially in the West, in the American and European press in particular, because of those relaxed measures. Many reports have alleged that the government in Nicaragua are not doing anything or not responding accurately or adequately. Sorry. Well, that's contested by the government there, who are saying that they have helped people out. They are providing free healthcare, but they had concerns that they didn't want to ground the economy to a halt just because of the sheer level of poverty that many people are within there. So they're keeping basic resources and work infrastructure going at the moment. They're reporting, in fact, interestingly, the lowest number of coronavirus COVID-19 fatalities within the Central American region. However, that's being disputed by other sources. It's being alleged by the opposition government, the opposition to government in Nicaragua. They're basically claiming that the government are covering up numbers of cases, but the government deny that and say that their measures have been effective and that the outbreak has just not affected them as much as other areas, or maybe it's just not affecting others. So they've carried on like Sweden with those moderate measures. There's been quite a story, though, having read an article about the situation in Nicaragua, where allegedly the opposition parties have used this to their advantage as an opportunistic fashion, where they're trying to sort of make the government look bad there, that they have been neglectful to the people. So there are really disputes about the numbers of people that are being affected. And the Nicaraguan government are in a difficult situation, really, because if they actually full on go with a complete lockdown, then really there are people in dire poverty there who really can't eat if they don't work. And it really is a case of many people having to work, in actual fact, like in many other African countries and potentially elsewhere in South America too. So if they do the lockdown, they could be very unpopular with their own people, and if they don't do it, they're quite unpopular with the press. And America, in actual fact, have taken this opportunity to impose economic sanctions on them, as well as Venezuela, Iran, China, and of course and I think maybe others. Well, the Nicaraguan government dispute that the infection is that much of a burden on them at the moment. But actual fact, looking more widely at that region, in 2019, last year, up to 3 million people died in the Central Americas of dengue fever, and 186,000 of those were from Nicaragua. So it's not like this is the first epidemic. They've experienced something far worse than this, and they're only reporting a limited number of cases at the moment, if you can believe those, at least. Brazil presenting a very interesting situation at the moment. They're the largest region, the largest country in South America, of course. Well, now, what's curious there is that the president of Brazil at the moment speaking out against COVID-19. And he's actually saying that it's being grossly exaggerated. And that's the president of Brazil. However, that's being disputed by local government and regulators there who are still imposing a lockdown. So there's some controversy there. Bolsonaro, I think his name is. Bolsonaro, in fact, has been telling people it's okay to continue going to church and other essential support groups. So rather controversially in that area. The press in other regions are really reporting that he's doing something dangerous, but he and many others are still claiming that in actual fact, the COVID-19 deaths are being over-reported and exaggerated. So in Brazil, I believe it's being reported that there are gangs that are enforcing the lockdown in many areas, but I'm getting limited reports confirming that, so I need to look more into it. Going now to a completely different part of the world, to the Philippines, where really quite a disturbing kind of phenomenon has taken place. But it's really just a continuation of what's gone on before, really, where their current president at the moment, if I pronounce it right, Duterte, perhaps it is, Duterte, Duterte. Well, he's ordered any people violating the shutdown orders to be shot. So anybody that goes outside of the home without permission, they potentially could be shot. Now, at the moment, we're not hearing reports of lots of people being shot, thankfully. Whether that's because they're not or we're not getting the reports, we don't know. I've only yet seen one report of a violator being shot so far, and he was allegedly accused of carrying a weapon and being intimidating with security forces. So we'll look to see what the situation as it unfolds there. There are allegations, however, that some police have been using dog cages to entrap or to punish violators of the lockdown, and there's reports that others are being forced to sit out in the midday sun, and we can imagine how unbearably hot that is. That's a particularly kind of mean sort of punishment to give to people, I suppose, to warn other people off from trying to leave their homes at the moment. But I say it's a continuation of some of his earlier policies. Human rights organisations have long been concerned about abuses going on in the country, and that the police there have a legal right to shoot dead drug dealers, but also drug users too, and other criminals potentially, without going through the proper judicial procedures, of having a fair trial, examining evidence, and dare I say, the hope of reforming somebody in prison, or giving some sort of mental health support to people that are perhaps drug addicted and may have problems. But no, they have the legal right there to shoot people and have done for some time. So the right to shoot people violating lockdown is just an continuation, an extension of earlier disturbing measures the government there have. But we'll look to hear about any more reports. So far, I've only heard of one person, a violator, being shot. But it sounds like there's potentially other measures to deter would-be violators too. Well, let's turn to India, staying in Asia now, the largest country enduring lockdown at the moment. They've been there for some weeks now, and a disturbing report in The Guardian alleges that some workers were being sprayed with a chemical agent called hypochlorite, apparently a bleaching agent which can cause irritation to the skin, eyes, and lungs. And I don't know how widespread that is, but apparently that was to help disinfect them should they be infected. But that's just crazy. I hope that's a very limited thing, and I sort of hope those poor people recover. But there have been various reports about people being forced from work and not able to sort of pay their rent, people at risk of homelessness there. Lots of concerns about that, actually. And in India, I've had reports too about an increase in the reporting of domestic abuse cases. So another concerning issue going on there. I think India's probably got the largest amount of people on the planet that are currently enduring the lockdown at the moment. So that's certainly an area to sort of look on and to keep an eye on. Let's turn to Africa briefly now, because at the beginning of the lockdown measures, it seemed like very few countries were being reported on there. They've reported very few cases in Africa, in actual fact. Why that is disputed. Some say because there's a lack of tests available there. They obviously, due to poverty, have a lack of healthcare systems and infrastructure in place. But it may well be that they're just not reporting it, perhaps. Maybe they have other infections that are going on there, and they're just not reporting those as COVID-19. That's happening in the West, potentially. Well, in Nigeria, the National Human Rights Commission, they've been reporting that there's 8 separate incidents of extrajudicial killings. 18 people have now been killed. Well, that was up to the 16th of April. The BBC have reported, and at that time, security forces had in fact killed more people than COVID-19 allegedly had. So that's going back a week or so ago now. So I'm not sure quite how that situation is going on now, though. So in Africa, of course, as in many regions in the third world, there's an issue with poverty and whether people have the funds and enough food to actually stay home. So the government in some regions are having to provide basic food provisions for them in order to keep them in the lockdown. Well, in Kenya, there were reports of people going out to protest and people just going out to continue working just because they had such a lack of food and resources at home. So that many people through poverty were just forced to continue and had to violate the measures. Just an unbelievably terrible situation, that's being ordered by law to stay at home and yet not having enough money. You can't have it both ways. You can't order someone to stay at home and not provide them with basic rations like food if they don't have that available. And at the very least, if you give someone a quarantine order to stay at home, you've got to provide them the necessities like food. You can't expect people in the poorest regions of the world to stay home and starve. You're not going to sit and watch your children starving, are you? So it's a tense situation in many regions where they are dependent on handouts now. There's some regions I hear where they're continuing working. Mexico, there's been a lot of people continuing working there. I saw a sign up that said, "This is Mexico and not Europe." I.e. we have a lot of poverty. We don't have the privilege of staying at home. If we don't work, we don't eat. And that's true in many poorer regions that either have that poverty and no savings to afford to buy food, and where they don't have government resources. I think government in many regions are at the moment having to provide provisions to the most poor. There's been a number of cases of heavy-handed policing in many parts of the world. I'm going to come on to discuss. In a recent report from the Human Rights Watchdog, they said that freedom of expression and access to information should be protected by governments. And they called for respect for human dignity. Whether in these strange and sometimes disturbing times that will be heeded, I don't know. There are so many different cases that we're hearing about, and they'll only be the tip of the iceberg, really. of various cases of police violence that's happening to suppress various protesters. I'm not saying that there's a lot of police also that aren't using moderate, measured, respectful measures too. I'm sure there are as well. Well, let's turn now to, I'm going all over the place actually, but in the Philippines and Thailand, staying with Asia, they have both filed states of emergency. They've both declared a state of emergency, which has granted the government there greater powers for a temporary period. We don't know whether that will be extended. This includes the ability to crack down on sharing of false information, whatever that is, a vague term that activists fear could be misused by officials. That's reported by The Guardian. Several other governments, it seems, are taking the opportunity to give themselves more authority at the moment. In Hungary, for example, a new set of measures, including jail terms for spreading false misinformation, whatever that amounts to. These measures allow the nationalist Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, if that's how it's pronounced, Viktor Orban, to rule by decree under a state of emergency that at the moment has no time limits. That's reported by The Guardian here in the UK. Well, there's many other concerning areas of the world of what's been going on. In South Africa, police have been enforcing a coronavirus lockdown and have reportedly fired rubber bullets towards hundreds of shoppers who were queuing outside a supermarket in Johannesburg. The police used whips, allegedly, to get the shoppers to observe social distancing rules. That's a report again from The Guardian there. How widespread those measures are, I don't know. But interestingly, with South Africa, they had virtually little to no cases before all these extreme measures were put straight away in place. Let's turn to Europe now. In Spain, well, they've had the lockdown there for some time now, a month and a few weeks. And I think they've been going through it for quite a long time. So obviously there's a growing frustration there. I believe that they've been trying to relax some of the measures, but only in a limited way. Well, here was a report from EOS.com regarding Spain, and I quote, "As the jogger struggled with police, screaming for help, she was filmed by residents who had zero sympathy for her plight. What's not fair is you going out running, you bloody idiot," shouted the woman apparently filming the encounter. A jogger who was being shouted at by unsympathetic residents as she was questioned by the police for going out jogging. Fortunately, here in the UK, we are still allowed to go out and have a daily exercise, going out walking or jogging, quite sensibly, I would say. It's good to go out, get fresh air. People still here, mostly that I've witnessed, are keeping a safe distance and distancing from other people still. But in countries like Spain, France and Italy, they've been having a much more enforced lockdown where they've actually had to stay in their homes unless they can get permission to go out, and going out has been severely limited for them, in fact. In France, that's been true as well, actually. Well, there were riots in Paris just a few weeks ago, reportedly. Riots broke out in Paris over anger, allegedly, about the mistreatment of ethnic minorities during the crisis. But of course, the protest was dispersed. That was a report from the Daily Mail here in the UK. And here's a report from France 24 from the 1st of April. One of the MPs told Parliament it is likely we are not heading towards a general deconfinement in one go and for everyone. So in other words, they're not going to release everyone suddenly It's if they're going to do it, it will be a slow and gradual thing by the sounds of it. The Interior Minister in France noted 359,000 fines for violating the lockdown. They had been issued since the lockdown began. But that was reported, as I say, on the 1st of April. So that's probably increased, one would imagine, by now. In Italy, the neighbouring country, also on lockdown, well, they've also had many reports of protests that have been put down by the police there, of course. So there have been a number of other protests taking place in America, of course, most notably Michigan that's been reported. And I think that's the only case that I've read about so far that has had some limited success. Well, there's been other protests in various states of America. But Michigan, as I hear at the moment, is the only one where they've actually been able, whether it was a result of the protests or not, but there was a response from the local governors there, and they have now agreed to reopen the city of Michigan. Whether that's fully opened or partially opened, it should take place, they've announced, on the 1st of May, I hear, after there was a big rally in Michigan of people demanding that the economy is reopened and people allowed to return to work. And I hear that there may well be some other protests arranged for May Day, the 1st of May, across America. How widespread those will be, I'm not sure, but I have had some reports that there are some arranging protests for that date in various regions of America. And America have had various other protests that have been taking place over the last few weeks, Michigan notably. Well, I'm going to come on now to discuss various things that have various news headlines of interest regarding the various measures being employed. A police force in the UK defended using drone cameras to shame people that were driving through the national park, reports The Guardian. One would have thought that a large area like the park was a sensible place to go, where you could keep a good, reasonable distance from other people. I go to the local park because it's got large playing fields, so there's lots of ample room for people to keep a reasonable distance from each other there. But the police there, they didn't think that it was a good idea. They didn't want it to attract many people. And I think a police spokesperson had responded saying that local villagers had complained that too many tourists were going in the area, and they were concerned about people parking up in local villages. So that was a police concern, I believe. The Humberside Police, and also in Northern Ireland, they have created online portals for people to report their neighbours for violating self-distancing measures. I overheard someone in the local park reporting a group of teenagers who had met up and were having a chat. They were reporting it to police. I've seen police quite often actually going through the parks. I've been moved on twice. I was once sat on a park bench, and another time I was sat under a tree, and I happily obliged and moved on because I wasn't that worried about having a walk and going off somewhere, continuing my exercise. But I do think it was a bit over the top. Sitting on your own outside, a safe distance from anyone else, it really isn't a risk to anybody. If you think about it logically, you're more at risk in a supermarket queue, aren't you? Even if you're a few meters apart, if there is an infection, that is. But I've returned to sitting down in the park, and there are many other people that do, and I think it's a reasonable place to go, whether there is or isn't an infection, in fact. Staying in the UK, police force has had a surge in calls from people reporting neighbours for going out on a second run. We're only really allowed one run a day, but that's not legally enforced. That's not a legal mandate. Police forces have had a surge to calls from people reporting neighbours for going out for a second run and for gathering in their back gardens. Police spokesman said, "We are getting dozens of calls from people who say, 'I want you to come and arrest them.'" That's a report from the BBC. Lots of people, it seems, reporting their neighbours, but I don't know if they represent a majority at all. In America, in Rhode Island, police began stopping cars with New York number plates on Saturday. The National Guard will help them conduct house-to-house searches to find people who travelled from New York and demand 14 days of quarantine. That's a report from Bloomberg. Well, moving on down under to Australia, where a really quite concerning report has come to my attention. This from the Sydney Morning Herald. Anyone who leaves their house without a reasonable excuse could spend up to 6 months in prison and face $11,000 in fines under a directive that gives police sweeping powers, reports the Sydney Morning Herald. That just sounds incredible. 6 months in prison for just going outside the house. I mean, I don't know quite what the instructions are in whether people are allowed to go out and exercise there or not. But you know, I'm just finding it just incredible, really. In New York, New Yorkers who break social distancing rules could face up to $500. That's the report from the Politico coming out on the 29th of the 3rd. And I think that's quite standard. Even in here in the UK, they're saying that people could be issued fines. Businesses that stay open despite the law, they could be given fines that ever increase. And there's no limit to the amount of fine that could be imposed for those that don't abide by the mandatory closures. And likewise, people that go out and meet in gatherings, they also can be given fines here in the UK, starting from just £30, but those can escalate. As that's what I believe, I've been told at least. Enforcing various people's freedoms seems to be going on in many different countries. Here's a report from a website called app.com coming out on the 13th of April. And I quote, "A 70-year-old township man was arrested twice on Saturday after police alleged he tried to enter 2 different local convenience stores without wearing his mask. And then he became belligerent. He was charged with second-degree terrorist threats during an emergency." And I believe that's in America, in actual fact. Quite how that qualifies as terrorist activity, that's a real stretch of the definition, isn't it? You know, one would imagine something that seriously endangers someone's life as something that was terrifying. You know, I can assume that he became belligerent and angry about it. You know, you might want to charge him with, you know, breaking the peace or something minor like that. But, you know, creating terrorism, that's a, you know, that's quite concerning, really, isn't it? Just for not wearing a mask, or I think it may have been probably, I suspect, for getting quite angry with them. And I kind of felt when I was out being questioned by the police for sitting down in a park, I felt there's really no need to get angry about a situation. The best thing is to try and discuss things calmly, but it's not always easy to do that, depending on the situation, I suppose. Here's the report again in America from CBS Local on the 17th of April, and they say officials say they routinely saw people visit the skate park, even children accompanied by their parents, according to the San Clemente Times. City officials followed in the footsteps of other cities, and they have filled in the skate park with 37 tons of sand. So, you know, whether that's meant or intended for a long-term measure, they are against people using the skating park there. You know, I suppose I suppose I can understand if people have got genuine fears that there is a real infection spreading. I can see, what would lead someone to do that. But for those of us that think those fears have been exaggerated, and that there isn't the evidence of the data to justify that, those obviously appear to be measures that are, over the top. Well, there's just a few other reports. I mean, there's so many you could just go through. I've just picked out a few. Some of these reports, in fact, were collated by a website called Off Guardian that I've been reading some interesting articles about. And I would encourage other people to look at some of their articles that are interesting. And here's another one. This comes from The Guardian, coming out on the 13th of April. A woman in Victoria was left feeling heartbroken and like a criminal after uniformed police officers carrying weapons interrupted her father's funeral over the Easter long weekend to enforce social distancing. Well, I find that one of the shocking elements, something like a sacred event like funerals, paying your respects to your loved one, to a child or parent that you've lost. There are people going through grief at the moment who are not able to share that grief, that cathartic grief. They're not able to share that with other families and other friends, something that since time immemorial, for thousands of years, has been a sacred event, something that helps those struggling with their grief. I know it helped me with my mum's passing quite recently, just a few months ago. And I think it's something that so many people have found just an essential part of the grieving process. So, you just think, spare a thought for those that have lost a loved one but aren't able to share that grief in a public funeral. How sad for them. At least they've got technology to talk to other people, and I hope they get counselling for that. But that's just incredibly sad for some people, and also the fact that some people might not be able to even say goodbye to loved ones who are potentially terminally ill and in quarantine. How sad is that as well? I hear here, at least in the UK, I think they have allowed people who are terminally or critically ill, at least, to have some contact with families, so at least to have a chance to say goodbye. Although, of course, you don't always know quite when someone's going to go, do you, when someone's ill? Sometimes it can be a shock, can't it? So I think there are lots of people, in really difficult situations like that. And, you just think people like that, especially, we need someone, I hope that others around them, aware of their situations, are able to reach out to them and give them that support that they'll obviously need through those times. It's all the more essential for them. Well, there are some other reports that's just a very general roundup of various concerning situations that I've been reading about in different countries, concerning how different countries are reacting in terms of the measures they're using to the alleged pandemic. Well, interestingly, Japan have had a much more relaxed approach, although they tend to be quite formal and authoritarian anyway. So they have been giving out strong advice and restricting some areas, but it's not been a total lockdown there. In Europe, especially, notably Sweden, have been much more relaxed in their measures. They've been giving out advice to people and allowing people to make discretion up to a certain degree. Sweden have been reporting kind of similar rates of mortality with the alleged COVID-19. So they were slightly below other countries on lockdown, like France, Italy, Spain, and the UK. They were slightly down. So, that might suggest that the lockdown measures aren't perhaps necessary if Sweden, with a more relaxed approach, have a similar kind of mortality rate. Well, there are also 6 states in America that are not going through lockdown. At least there were on the 4th of April. I'm not sure if that may have changed since then. Or Arkansas Iowa, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Utah, and Wyoming, all who are reporting very few cases of COVID-19 strain of coronavirus, despite not having any lockdown enforced. That was true up to 4th of April at least. I might have to look into that and see whether that's what the situation is there. Wyoming actually were reporting 0 cases, whether that's because they had a lack of testing available, or whether that's because they weren't reporting influenza as COVID-19. That's perhaps disputed by some. So it's quite interesting how different countries are responding differently with different measures to the alleged pandemic. When I come on now just to talk briefly about some other issues concerning technology and the potential being talked about more and more now for something called this COVID-19 digital certificates that are starting to be talked about in more articles. Here's an article from Coindesk.com from the 13th of April. The COVID-19 Credentials Initiative, that's the CCI, is working on a digital certificate that lets individuals prove that they've recovered from the novel coronavirus or have received a vaccination once one is available. So there would be a certificate, a digital one, and that would have a record of who's got vaccinations. And there's other reports that are claiming that that certificate is what may allow some people the freedom to travel and to work in some places. And I suppose, therefore, may restrict some people's abilities, those that perhaps don't have the vaccines. And there are lots of people now quite concerned about that, what with many more reports coming out about that. 9 News, some sort of channel, I believe, in Australia, they are reporting, and I quote, mobile phone tracking software could be compulsory if not enough Australians voluntarily download the application to help COVID-19 case tracking or case tracing, sorry. So there's some sort of app that they want people to voluntarily use now that will help them to identify who they've been in contact with, and that could become mandatory. That's just speculation from the news agency in Australia at the moment, but I think there are concerns about that, about who could be using that information and what their intentions possibly could be. There is an article from The Guardian along these themes coming out on the 17th of April, and they say there is a danger that these new, highly invasive measures will become the norm around the world. Sorry, that was claimed by the Business Insider, rather. They were concerned about these invasive new measures becoming a normal procedure around the world. The Guardian have an article that claims that in Norway they have now unveiled a new app called the Smittestopp. I don't know if I pronounced that right. The Smittestopp. Anyway, this app, which will notify users if they've been less than 2 meters from an infected person. Quite how they would know, how someone, if they're infected, and whether they're infected with other things besides that strain, But I think the concern is whether that information would potentially be used by others and for what reasons. The New York Times on the 18th of April, they reported, imagine an America divided into 2 classes. It will be frightening, a frightening schism. A WHO special envoy on COVID-19 predicted. Those with antibodies will be able to travel and work, and the rest will be discriminated against. That was a prediction by a WHO special envoy, and that report came through the New York Times. And I think more and more people are concerned about the potential use of these technologies for what's being called tracking and tracing. I'm just not sure